Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prize of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Swithun Dobson. This is a sort of continuation on a theme that I've talked about a lot on this channel, the private production of defense, and in part is a continuation of the broader discussion that I had with Bob Murphy on the Tom Woods show about the private production of defense, where Swithun got a hold of me a few months ago and said, well, I've been thinking about the objections you've brought up and, how my, given libertarian core assumptions, which, like no taxes, no state, how could you provide these services? And so, I thought, well, we usually have the best conversations on these topics when it's just a conversation rather than a formal debate. So that's kind of why we're here. So, Swithun, why don't you explain the basis behind your essay, Anarchist National Defense?
Well, as you mentioned, I tried to answer some of the objections that you had raised in your debates with sort of David Friedman, Bob Murphy, etc. But just to outline the general claim of how I think it could work. It doesn't necessarily have to work this way, but I think this is a plausible model. In principle, it's not a very innovative one. It's similar to David Friedman's, Roderick T. Long's, and also similar in certain respects to Keith Preston's as well. The essential idea is that the mainstay of the military would be a volunteer militia, supplemented by a specialist contractors, effectively. The reason for this is multiple. One, it's cheaper. Standing armies are incredibly expensive. Two, standing armies, well, you don't really want one. You don't really want a huge army in your border who has overwhelming military power, who can then decide, oh, well, you didn't used to pay us tax. You used to pay us because we were decent. Well, we kind of like some money anyway. It's not really something you're going to want. So for financial reasons of keeping the costs down, and also for internal sort of security, as it were, to prevent not just foreign oppression, but also internal oppression, you don't really want that to take place. I mean, as an aside, one thing that crystallized this for me was looking at Australia with their current sort of lockdown situation there. And I was thinking, if you had a volunteer militia, there is absolutely no chance this would ever happen. There is no chance. The only reason they do this is because the state has too many people on their payroll who have a hell of a lot of guns. And that's the reason why you can lock them indoors all day. And oh yes, and you are right. They did round up all the guns a number of years ago. That is also true, Todd. Yes, I can't remember when that was, but yeah, they did do a bit of.
There were two rounds, one in the late '90s and then one in the early 2010s.
Yeah, I'd forgotten. I remember they did do that. Yeah, so as we would have predicted when you round up all the guns. So, and also on the side with rounding up the guns, the Taliban are apparently doing that as well in Afghanistan now that they're winning. It's like, oh, no one else. They don't need the guns anymore because the Taliban are here. We want the Americans. So we want a major volunteer militia. But of course, being libertarian, broadly speaking, division of labor works, and so specialist contractors for tactical maneuvers, probably dealing with some specialist weaponry or whatever. It's going to make sense to have some private contractors to supplement the militia. So that basically the model. Now, to the three major objections that Todd had raised in the past, which I'll attempt to respond to now, and then we can go back and forth on various things. So Todd had made a few objections in the past, which were, I think, three or fourfold. First of all was mobilization, finance, standardization problems, and the limitations on research and development. So the first objection was trying to mobilize the forces could be difficult. Using mercenaries, etc., is going to be a problem. They can flip bounties, etc., etc. You don't want that. Is always going to be a possibility. In the same way, it's always a possibility that your state army can decide that, well, we're no longer going to follow the civilian government. We'll just do our own thing and have a coup. So that's always a possibility. What I would say is, in a society in which you have and you pay for specialist contractors, I would expect for this to function, what you're going to want to do is is to have the contractors have an interest which is not just financial in the protection of those areas. So I would envisage in a sort of broadly Ancapistan or whatever you want to call it, it's not going to be an equal opportunity society. As Hopper points out with the right of exclusion, I would expect that, well, for it to function, now, the extent to which it didn't do this might be the extent to which they would flip and try and take over in certain ways, or just not do their job, is you're going to want to have the people and the contractors who are going to be natives to the area, they have historical ties to it, their family are there, etc. Because you don't just want them to have a financial incentive to be there. If they just have a financial incentive to be there, someone can always pay them more. But if you have it that they are paid and that they have some sense of duty or honor or some sort of belongingness to the area, then the probability of these sorts of flipping of bounties, etc., is not going to be as likely in those scenarios. So I think you can pay people and still work without them causing you a problem. On the finance and production point, I do think finance is possible. One thing to remember is when you're in a war situation, it's not always the case that the entire country is at war at all the time. So parts of the place can continue with normal market action to generate finance. So if, for instance, that the contractors or even the supply lines to the militia could be funded by some sort of mutual agency or whatever, then they can still generate funds and farm and whatever and send things to the fighters in the situation that they are taking place in. Now, obviously, this is going to depend. Obviously, if supply lines are stretched, etc., this might become more difficult. Depends where the fighting takes place. Although I'd imagine most of the fighting would take place relatively close to the place where they live, because it's going to be, well, it should be a defensive war, or that's what I'm going to be defending. I'm not going to be defending aggressive ones. So having somewhat quite far away is going to be unlikely to some extent. And also, if you have sort of anarchist communities, they're going to be relatively small anyway. So they're probably not going to be ending up stretching too far. Also, on a sort of like a finance angle in general, to try and raise it, I do think forms of crowdfunding probably are going to get around a lot of the problems of sort of like free rider problems of, oh, well, I won't pay because I'll wait for somebody else to pay. I think the pledging and the automatic taking of money, etc., can mean that obviously free riding can happen. There's no getting around it. It can happen. But again, the extent to which you're invested in the area and you want it to be defended because you're there can mitigate this to some extent. I do think we've got to take more of a cultural aspect to the society along with a purely economic one for it to work.
Just to interject real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
The other thing too is from a libertarian perspective, right? If we look at the financing of modern wars, they grow exponentially with the beginning of fractional reserve lending with the Bank of England. So, for example, the history of England's ability to power project was limited throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance due to finance issues, which, from the point of view of a libertarian, is a feature, not a bug. You don't want the empire to grow indefinitely, right? England was generally sufficient to defend itself, but not sufficient to invade France or other parts of Europe in the long run. With the modern lending practice, you're then able to finance these wars, beginning with Queen Anne or William of Orange, that just continue indefinitely. So again, if you're assuming the more defensive oriented, there's this sort of built-in discipline then. It's like, okay, this is how much money we're likely going to be able to raise. The other thing that you could do is, of course, take it. That's what a lot of imperial societies like, King of France or the Ottoman Empire or the Holy Roman Emperor, they just take the resources they need. But again, I guess assuming an armed citizen population, that'd be a lot harder. So I guess right here, this is where we want to like sort of optimize the spectrum here. So I fully understand with a libertarian society, you're not going to be having a global imperial army or global imperial navy. That's not what anybody who's written about the topic wants. Fine, we got that. I think what you've said, what Long has said, and what David Friedman said is probably closer to what would be practical. I guess the question is then, once we look at the interdiscipline that finance would put onto a libertarian society, and given the narrow parameters of defense, would they be able within those parameters to finance a war? So, for example, when I talked to David Friedman, he said, well, we can just look at Afghanistan. They get occupied for 20 years and they keep fighting. I'm like, well, yeah, David, but the thing is that's highly destructive to capital goods. In a libertarian society, which seeks to, maximize the production of the capital stock, I mean, that turn of phrase shows up a lot with Francis Hapa's writings. You're not going to fight a people's war of liberation. Afghanistan is not the model for you because you're going to lose all your capital stock. That's why Afghanistan is still stuck in the Middle Ages, because every time they try to develop, they get invaded by somebody. So, yeah, you can technically win. That's a very loose definition of winning. Or Vietnam when the United States invaded. That seems to be counterproductive to a libertarian point of view. So if you want something, more effective than that, but not so effective that it leads to you becoming an imperial power, if we sort of, tweak all the dials and knobs, can we get that? Because I think that's still an open question. But even with all of those caveats in place, I think that's what I would say would be a core amount of my financial objection.
Well, I mean, to answer that is going to be, it depends. I mean, it would really depend on how much you would need to spend to basically dissuade anybody from attacking you. I mean, that's ultimately what you're going to want to do. You're going to make the costs of, eventually, yes, you will want the final threat of, well, yes, if you do occupy us, there will be guerrilla warfare for 20 years. That is something you probably want to project in the society. But you obviously want to avoid getting there to begin with. And so the question is, how do you reduce those costs? How do you increase the costs of anyone actually doing that to begin with? That's the difficult part. So that's going to depend on, so I suppose you're an island, because a lot of, Bob Murphy's fictional work is based around an island, because everyone always likes islands because they're easy to defend comparatively. And so we've got to think about, how are you going to be attacked, etc. So for instance, I think, potentially, in the old one you had with Keith, you could have submarines, aircraft batteries against planes. You could even build physical walls. In principle as well, what you could have is you could have semi-militarized dwellings to a large extent. Now, again, depends where they are and when we're on the border, because obviously the further they are towards a neighbor, they're more likely to be engaged in fighting than if they're further within. So I suppose the answer to your question is, well, if they're willing to pay enough, well, then yes. The question is whether they're willing to pay enough and can they deploy it. That said, as well, something you've mentioned as well, talking about pacifist communities, there's not only the negative aspect, there's a positive aspect to try and stop someone from invading you, which is, well, we've got stuff that you want, so you better not mess us up. So the only two countries that weren't invaded during the Second World War wasn't Sweden and Switzerland.
Yeah,
if I remember correctly. And Sweden, because they have, is it a huge iron mining?
Well, industry? Yeah, they had a large iron mine supply, and they basically gave the Germans what they wanted. But what people tend to forget is that, like Switzerland, it was kind of Fortress Sweden. They mobilized a very large proportion of their population for defense. And basically, they played this game with Germany where they raised the cost of invasion to a point where Germany's like, what we want to get from you is not worth the cost. And they lowered the cost for what Germany wanted by giving them iron supplies. And so it was a delicate balancing act, but it was enough to keep them from getting invaded.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because the general libertarian position when it comes to trading is like, well, just trade with them. It's going to promote peace. That was Richard Cobden's argument in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
If you provide things that people want, so that doesn't necessarily entirely answer your objection, but there's both carrots and sticks when it comes to it. Could the society, just on a purely negative sense, make the cost too high? Well, possibly. I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer, because then you're getting to questions about, well, how much is military technology going to cost? What type of military technology do you need? What military technology does the enemy have? As to whether or not you can prevent any invasion. Because obviously as well, state armies get defeated by state armies all the time. So to say that, well, we couldn't defend against, let's say, comparatively the Roman Empire of today, well, that's not really a huge objection to an in principle defense, because, well, you wouldn't have been able to defeat that with a state army anyway.
Let me interject real quick here. One thing that I think gets really to the point of both financing and production for war is when war, prior to the advent of gunpowder and ships of sail, war was not capital intensive. You could be nomads and beat the Roman Empire. You're non-state actors. I mean, that's the definition of a non-state actor, and you can beat the Roman Empire. So, or Chinese Empire. So when war is not capital intensive, that's a lot easier of a problem to solve. But as war becomes more and more capital intensive, the question then is, okay, who can support the cost of capital more? So, for example, what I brought up to Bob Murphy was this. What makes large-scale military production possible is economies of scale. So when the United States in World War II could just churn out gobs of tanks and airplanes and ships because they had economies of scale. But the problem was these large manufacturing conglomerates are generally, on a libertarian model, predicted not to exist because they only exist due to legal privileges granted by the state. So in a libertarian society, we wouldn't expect to see these large conglomerates like Lockheed Martin and General Motors, which, because they're not going to have an economy of scale, would raise the cost of producing complicated, specialized military hardware. And so in the process of capitalization for war, I mean, again, it's not insuperable, right? I mean, Vietnam and Afghanistan are low capital societies and they still beat the United States. It's not impossible, but it does create a problem. And I think that's the problem that is the ultimate finance production problem.
Well, one of the things of the economies of scale, you could argue, well, this is a Kevin Carson argument, but they didn't really have economies of scale in those factories, even though they appeared they did. The only reason they did appear to have the economies of scale as centralized production is because distribution was so cheap. Why? Well, because the state had built all the roads and the interstate. Oh, I know the road system primarily in the interstate thing is a post Second World War phenomenon to a large extent, but the subsidized infrastructure is relevant here. And so you have to consider the relatively higher borrowing or tax rates that would have to fund that vis-a-vis the production of the military hardware. So I do think, yes, you probably wouldn't have the large factories producing it. But the question is whether you could produce things at sufficiently low cost to be able to make them viable. So I do think, interestingly, with no regulations on this, the advent in things like 3D printing could be particularly interesting here. Because you could have a myriad of different people in their own homes manufacturing their own weapons. Now, it's relatively primitive at present. The question is how far could it get? Also, with military hardware in general, if you have the absence of intellectual property law, incrementally increasing quality and of delivery and certain things could be significantly higher than would exist in other countries. And also, if you're going to take the position that the libertarian society is going to be on average richer than it otherwise would have been, then would they be able to produce enough that they need to, maybe relatively high unit costs, but because they don't need to produce that much, because remember, we're not going out to fight the Japanese, we're not going to send we're going to send aircraft carriers to Pearl Harbor, or, turn up late again in Europe to claim victory again. I mean, those sorts of costs it's not the same type of war. So, yeah, okay, maybe the unit cost possibly could be higher. The question is whether people would pay.
That's it. Hold on. That's actually a good point, because when America had the concept of made in America, the global trade people were saying, well, look, here's the problem. It's a higher unit cost. But a lot of Americans were willing to pay that higher unit cost because they perceived that it was a higher quality good. And so theoretically, you could argue that the production of defense creates higher quality goods such that people would say, well, look, it's a higher unit cost, but I prefer to have this because it's a higher, right? If you lower the unit cost, like having it made in China, you lose quality control. You might get, poisoned dog food that kills your pet. You might get poisoned, drywall. I remember there was a drywall recall a few years back from China. So that you lose quality control, right? So there's trade-offs here. It's not just the cost of unit production. And that's one possibility.
Oh yeah, I was going to say as well. If you go for more localized production, they could be supported on the basis that it's going to be security, and we're going to make sure security exists when we need it. So we're going to want to have relatively local production as well, on sort of like a made in America or made in the anarchist community, or at least close to it.
So instead of cruelty free, you'll advertise it as NAP produced. NAP compliant production. So instead of having like the far left cruelty free tagline for anything produced, it'll be produced under NAP compatible conditions
by the people of the NAP. That's what it's going to be. Yeah, it's entirely possible. As I say, there's lots of other reasons you might expect the prices to be lower, to be richer on average, and whilst the unit costs are higher, if you have enough of it, and if you can have enough stockpiles of munitions so that you're able to, at least in the short run, be able to defend yourself whilst you ramp up domestic production. I think in general, my position there would be that it's going to be a relatively more decentralized society. That's taken for a given, assuming it works. I would expect one of the characteristics of that is going to be some sort of nimble, what's the best word for it? Flexible sort of production. I mean, this is an interesting, as a side with this, was people were saying with respect to coronavirus outbreaks in England that this was going to be worse than it would have been with like the Hong Kong flu in the 1960s, because they run the hospitals at much higher capacity now than they used to reduce the average cost of each of the beds that they run. And obviously there's a trade-off between being able to deal with peak demand and being able to run at a low unit cost, which of course the ideal response to this would be to be able to produce emergency capacity when you need to produce emergency capacity. And actually they did that in England with the coronavirus stuff, with what we call the Nightingale hospitals. And they did that very quickly, actually. The NHS was actually reasonably efficient at doing that. The problem was they had no one to staff them. And for various...
There's, to this point, right? This is you're talking about the elastic demand, because it's not constant. What we do see, this is a military principle, but I think it mirrors this market principle, is in Alfred Thayer Mahan's History of Sea Power on History. He points out in the 17th century, with the rise of the Royal Navy displacing Spain and France as great naval powers, that one of the reasons why England was successful is that while the demand for the Royal Navy was elastic, the demand for merchant marines was inelastic. And so the merchant marines could always be cannibalized into the Royal Navy to compensate for attrition within warfare. Whereas the French and the Spanish had small merchant marine fleets, so they could artificially pump up the size of the Navy during peacetime. But as it suffered wartime attrition, they didn't have an easily accessible supply of sailors to then replace those that died or were injured at war. So if you could maybe imagine this is where David Friedman, I think, has something. He talks about the idea of having large-scale war games as like public spectacles, like football. If you want to have an elastic supply of servicemen, even though you're not always at war, right? So the demand for war is elastic, but the demand for entertainment is inelastic. If you pursue his idea of having these war game drills as like public entertainment, you could have a constantly high level of military readiness based on, that's just fun. That's just what we do, after the pub or something. And then that allows you to dip into that when you have the elastic demand of being invaded. So I guess that helps the problem a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea, because I mean, there was the idea, or I think this was one of the ideas behind a lot of the games sports they did in public schools in the 19th century. And the idea from, was it World War One, that they claimed that, oh yes, World War One was won, even though we didn't win, it was an armistice, was won on the playing fields of like Eton and Harrow.
Yeah, another good example was the mandated archery of the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Right. That was the only legal sport that was allowed. And so everybody became crack bowmen. And when they invaded France, the French knights and chivalry were massacred. So, I mean, that's actually a historical example that backs up what David Friedman is theoretically arguing. Now, does it have to be war gaming per se, like paintball, or could it be military type sports like hunting and marksmanship and whatever that is? You could have the inelastic demand for entertainment and diversion and fun being used as a way to fuel the elastic demand of warfare demands. Now, that's for the production of manpower. I don't know how that would work for the production of capital stock for fighting a war.
Yeah, that is separate. But with the manpower, I mean, I'd imagine a society in which almost all able-bodied men were enlisted or a member of a volunteer militia. There was an expectation that they would join, and that they would be under regular or semi-regular training. Now, how much this needs to be, I'm far from an expert. I suppose as well, I have the idea, maybe there's some founding myth or something of a society in which they kept the invaders out, and this is some big cultural norm, and then all able-bodied men were expected to keep up the honor of the founders of the community, something like that. I mean, I suppose that sounds somewhat Roman, but I suppose that worked to a large extent.
Well, and also given the fact that libertarians like the civil law of the Romans. So, for example, there was an essay probably 15 years ago by Stefan Kinsella about Justinian's legal code, where he said he wanted to name his next dog Justinian because he liked the deontological nature of Roman law. So there is a precedent for this Roman system of culture and society. I think one other element that is really important, that was one of my objections, was the issue of coordination. How are you going to coordinate any sort of national defense at all? Because what we have learned from coalition warfare that Europe has been engaged in since the Spanish Armada, if not earlier, is that if you don't have a centralized command structure, you will lose. So the Allies in World War I centralized under, Joffre, who is the French generalissimo of the entire Allied forces, coordinating the Italians, French, German, Italians, and British and Americans. Whereas the Central Powers did not centralize their coordination, and they lost. And so there's a certain sense in which the libertarians like centralized decision-making in the form of a CEO, and there's a certain sense in which they don't. And I think, generally speaking, with the military, that's one of the areas in which they don't. And so the only way I could see a libertarian society dealing with this is it's gonna ruffle some of their feathers, because I know in Democracy of the God That Failed, Hoppe hates the idea of usufruct. He says that democracy is usufruct government, and that's why it's so crappy at making decisions. But the problem is, the only way you could coordinate defense over people's private property is if these military corporations had usufruct rights over everything. Because if they had usufruct rights, they could say, well, look, I have the right to up until deploying military forces. Like, I can't own the title to the land. I can't do other things on it because usufruct limits what you can actually do on the property. But if it was understood that this defense agency, which, based on various rating agencies and whatever, was really, really trustworthy and really, really effective, then what you could do is say, well, look, we'll have usufruct rights over these territories. I mean, that seems to be the most compatible to a libertarian principle, the NAP and everything else. But a lot of libertarians don't like the idea of usufruct, so I don't know what to say to that.
Oh well, I don't have a huge objection with user fructs. I think we discussed before some of the libertarian concepts of property. The problem is they tend towards physicalism, which Rothbard implicitly acknowledges doesn't work when he deals with pollution, particularly noise pollution in particular. Or actually, no, just sound waves. Well, if you own all the physical property, it's like if the sound waves go through, it's a violation of it. It's like that's going to be a problem if we're going to think that radio is okay. So I don't use it per se. I would say now, when it comes to centralization, let's assume you're correct. Let's assume they do need to be centralized. Let's say we have all these militias. There's no reason per se why you couldn't create. There couldn't be some sort of overlapping, sort of a voluntary coordinator who sort of like voted in, as it were, from militia commanders in the various areas to make broad military decisions to coordinate. I mean, when it comes to general coordination today, with modern technology, it's significantly easier to send information and to receive it and to coordinate your action. So, I mean, so for instance, if during the wars of Alexander the Great, all the nations that he sort of he attacked in the cities, if they were to be able to sort of like contact each other and coordinate a defense at some point, they probably would have stopped him. So I don't see why you couldn't, if it was necessary, assuming it was, to have a voluntary coordination. Now, of course, that coordination could break down because some local commanders go, no, this is stupid, let's not do it. But then again, that's also got a benefit that, well, actually the central decision making may actually be a bad idea. It might be the case of, no, we don't want to do this. This is a bad idea. We should do something else. We should go and fight the National Socialists, or we shouldn't just sort of decide and have the Nazi Soviet pact just wait. We should try and defend ourselves against them immediately and ignore Stalin. I mean, that could be the correct decision. So the question is, insofar as centralization is necessary, would it be stable? Well, again, that's going to be contingent on how trusted, how much faith anyone has in sort of the military commander who's basically chosen, and issues like that. And also remember, the coordination of this would be significantly easier than the examples you give in the First and Second World War, just because, well, we're just going to stay where we are. Now, of course, we might meet them in the field. Ideally, you don't want to meet them in your urbanized areas, at least not directly. I mean, yes, it can get to that and you can defend it, but you'd rather not, because the damage that could be occurred is not going to be good for you. So you might meet them, but you're not going to meet them miles away, and you're not going to have to coordinate over vast swathes of Europe or whatever for your actions. So even if centralization is required, I don't think it is insurmountable. And I imagine and the areas over which you're going to coordinate are going to be less. Are going to make the challenge of that smaller than it would have been in those examples you gave.
One point that I want to bring up too, that I don't know if you directly answered in the essay I read, and also I know I only brought it up at the end of the debate, so in all fairness, Bob Murphy didn't have a chance to answer it. England at the time of World War I was very pro laissez-faire. It wasn't the labor government socialist type that we're familiar with today. And there were two problems that developed in the total war scenario. One was the great shell shortage of 1915, which Lloyd George solved by essentially collectivizing production at the expense of consumer goods. Right? We saw this in World War II for the United States as well. Because the reasoning is this: there's a certain cost of production there's a certain cost of total resources for war production, whatever that happens to be, based on the threat level of the war. And the question is, can you fight the war and still maintain pre-war civilian consumption? Now, we've seen with the United States beginning in Korea that we've been able to do that. But prior to the hyperabundance of U.S. post-World War II, almost all previous wars had some form of rationing and, frankly, collectivized production where the resources were just not allowed to go to civilian use, which is why people had victory gardens and why they weren't allowed to eat butter during World War II, and they had to ersatz the food in order to give it for the military production. So what it would seem plausibly is that the collectivizing of production gave England the means to fight the war against Germany in World War One. And then we've already mentioned the conscription shortage. England didn't turn into conscription until 1916. Now, we've already talked about how the elastic demand for war and manpower could possibly be plausibly dealt with by the inelastic demand for entertainment, thanks to the ideas of David Friedman. But what I would argue is that we have a problem with production, because even if we admit we're not going to fight a world war, we're just going to be Belgium. But if Belgium gets invaded by Germany, I don't know if Belgium would, because Molinari comes from Belgium, so what's a good example, actually, the first private production theorist. Would a privately funded Belgian army be able to, would it not run into shortages of military armaments because it would not lack the ability to compel lower peacetime consumer good consumption? Because for every time T, where time T is the state of war with the ever increasing demands of war, there's still a fixed amount of resources at time T, that instant in time. And where do those resources go? Do they go to the war effort, or do they go to civilian consumption? And generally speaking, if you want to win the war, you're going to have to shift it away from civilian consumption to military consumption. But I'm not saying you can't do it with the idea of NAP, respect, or all these other libertarian core beliefs. But I do think it's a problem that has never been addressed and really ought to be, because I think it's a serious problem for production of military goods.
I think that's actually more of a problem if you have the private production of defense model of, say, Hopper and Rob Murphy. The reason being is you basically have other people doing the fighting for you. And so you're sort of like, oh, no, I'm doing this icky fighting stuff. That's going to do someone else. Oh, no, I'd rather have a new car. Oh, they want some more stuff. Nah, I get a car. Now, I actually think this is a feature of the militia model, because in this model, you actually have volunteer fighters who are invested in the fighting. They're not just being called up just because there's a war effort on. They're regularly part of this, and this is what they're expected and trained for, and they're willing to defend it for the territory. And well, if that is the case, you would expect then that they would put more of their own money, because they are fighting as well, and they'd rather not die and win. They would rather put, at least to some extent. Obviously, you might get a situation where, look, we can't win. We may as well roll over and let someone win. That is, of course, a possibility. And in some cases, maybe the most prudent thing to do. But I think insofar as you're actually involved in the war effort, you probably voluntarily change your consumption. So, for instance, okay, your wife is at home with the children or whatever while you're fighting. It's like, well, I need enough so that they can survive. But the way they're going to be better off in the future is if we win. And so actually my pay packet, my savings or whatever, we're going to put more towards military production of certain forms. And I mentioned, if you've got things like 3D printing as a potential option to get more things off the ground, I'd also wouldn't be surprised if with the flexibility, if there's certain factories that could not be, well, it's going to depend on how specialized a production level they are, how much they can be modified. I mean, to what extent you might be able to sort of modify existing civilian production to military production of munitions, etc. That would be always an interesting question, and a technical problem which I have no expertise in answering. But that is, of course, a possible solution to trying to raise up and going back to that flexibility argument made before, because I really do think that seems to be the most logical, at least insofar as you can increase capacity.
I think one other thing too, given that a lot of right-wing anarchist and libertarian thought is inspired by the early American Republic, there was a common slogan called "Millions for Defense, not 1 cent for tribute." And if you can manufacture that kind of identity and persona, it does create a sort of built-in pressure where these people will voluntarily pay more for defense. I think another thing that could deal with the necessity to reduce civilian consumption. Because again, like I said, at time T, there's only a fixed amount of resources. The pie hasn't grown yet because we're controlling for that instant of time. What you could do, and I think this would, depending on how sophisticated your communications technology is, I don't know how tall you're going to get in a right-wing anarchist society, but given the tremendous effectiveness of social media and advertising at changing people's behavior, you could have a massive blitz, essentially guilt-tripping people for consuming civilian products and swag while the war's going on. And there might be some people that's never going to work on, but a lot of people it will.
Yeah, that's certainly the case, and that's interesting as an aside. I read an article recently that I think a NATO-funded body were basically saying that the next arena of war is the mind, and they're using insights from like behavioral economics and stuff to try and hack the brain as part of military domination. Now, they were couching this in terms of, oh no, the evil Chinese and the Russians are doing it, so we have to defend against them. It's like, I don't really trust the Americans when it comes to defend. So that's of course possible. But I mean, one thing to remember here is I do think if a libertarian society, as I envisage, will work, you're going to have a lot of cultural buy-in. A lot of it's going to be based on reputation. It's going to be based on trust. And that is going to cultivate a particular type of mentality, which I think will increase the probability that people will engage in the ways that they would need to defend the country. So, for instance, as it stands today, any individual is so far removed from anything of the police, the military, that it's essentially somebody else doing it for you. And so you feel like you have no responsibility towards it at all in any way, shape, or form, which isn't. If, as I say, if the libertarian society was work, is something would have to be radically different. And I think this goes against probably Walter Block's approach to thin libertarianism of, well, yeah, okay, theoretically, yeah, it could work, but is it going to be maintainable? No, it's not. You're going to need a whole other sort of cultural assumptions and ways and doing things and means of it, which is why I mentioned, I suspect I didn't mention at this point, I'd imagine that you're going to get relatively culturally and ethnically homogenous groups. These are the ones that are the most similar. They're the ones who are going to trust each other the most. Those are the ones who will fight for each other. I mean, you're not going to get, oh yes, I'm going to fight to the death for Hopper Inc. Like, I don't think you of big PDA is going to do that. I mean, they're unlikely, especially when Murphy Inc. is paying you more. So I think that's just one thing to emphasize insofar as how different such a society would have to be to even function generally. I think is worth noting. But as I say, I do think modification of civilian technology, 3D printing, and just generally, my expectation is that you have lots of armaments around anyway, and so there'll be a lot of military hardware to use. Now, it's relatively small arms. I mean, it's not going to be, everyone's not going to have missiles, although they might. You could have recreational nukes. I suppose that's always a fun libertarian.
This is a new thing, so I'm throwing at you because this is something I didn't throw at anybody yet, Bob or anyone else. One thing that I think is interesting, if you look at what we might call thick right libertarians, there was a time when right before Charlottesville, where there was the alt-right libertarian pipeline, where a lot of libertarians were becoming alt-right with a qualified sense because they understood that there were certain cultural norms and mores that had to be preserved in order to maintain the underlying substrata of a market economy. Okay, so, and that's why they shifted more to the alt-right position. And then after Charlottesville, a lot of them went away. Hoppe arguably was one of the first guys to do this in his chapter, Democracy, the God That Failed, Why Libertarians Ought to Be Conservatives. He says, straight up that these are the underlying principles we need to assume in order to have a market economy. But there's a problem here, because while I would agree in fact that yes, to have this bottom up intentional community, you would need to have these taboos and social norms. And a lot of the theory on law without the state, they talk a lot about social norms as well. Now, one problem: a lot of right libertarians are radical capitalists, anarcho-capitalists, and this is not a critique of capitalism narrowly. It's a critique of what's called technique. The French theorist Jacques Ellul writes about technique, which is the pursuit of absolute efficiency in terms of human organization and machines for the sake of production. And so arguably capitalism and communism are both competing to be more efficient. It's just clear that capitalism is more efficient, and that's why it won the Cold War. But a precondition for efficiency is social plasticity, which is the removal of taboos and identities, because the efficiency principle needs to have at any time t access to all possible innovation. And if you have taboos and social groups, intermediate social groups like guilds, fraternities, tribes, they create trade secrets, which limit the spread of knowledge, which limits the spread of which is necessary for the production of technique. And so if you have a highly technological society, which is built on the need for efficiency, then there's a built-in system that erodes all of these taboos, which are also necessary for a market economy. And it creates this really contradictory feedback loop. And I wonder how that would happen, because we've actually seen the dissolution of these groups in America in our lifetimes.
Yes, you have had the dissolution of those groups, although that's because of, that's because of very much of a state capitalist system rather than anything approaching what the ANCAP libertarian society would be. That is, of course, a potential issue. Although I would argue that certainly the Austrian school wouldn't focus on efficiency in the same way that, say, the Chicago school would focus on efficiency, because the question of efficiency is efficient by what standard? Now, I'm not trying to turn into a pre-sup at this point by bandying about by what standard. But if you have a relatively centralized society and they go, okay, well, I could do this and it might make me some extra money in the short run, but actually will harm me in the long run, because, again, this is probably going to be what's required. You're going to have to have relatively far-sighted, low time preference society, because that's a way of keeping in check these norms, even though it might seem on the in the short run to be more efficient. Although that said, I mean, a lot of the dissolution of sort of traditional units wasn't because of efficiency per se. It was just because the reduced earning power. So, for example, the corporations wanting lots of cheap labor in the form of women who were liberated from their husbands and their households. I mean, why did that happen to a large extent? Well, because the husband could cease to earn enough such that his wife could be in a sufficient state and his children, so that they entered it. And that wasn't because of efficiency per se. This was because of the financial system, etc. And reductions of increase of barriers to entry and stuff that made the working man not earn as much as otherwise would be able to.
Well, let me just interject real quick here. So if we look at the destruction of these intentional identities in America, there are, I think, three things that work in concert together. One are market forces, one is the state, and one is NGOs. So a lot of this, quote, social stuff come from like the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and it's these NGOs that are, but what I'm saying is in a society that is technological, and to the extent that a right-wing anarchist society, well, it's often presupposed to be one. Like for example, Hans Hoppe and Bob Murphy are like, well, look, we'd be like space age, with lasers and stealth, and the state would just get, little puny state armies would get vaporized. Well, if you are going to build this, quote, high-tech society, then the underlying logic of high tech, that could be a socialist one, it could be an anarchist one, it could be a capitalist one, but the underlying ideology of high tech is going to want to degrade these institutions, but they also happen to be the institutions necessary for its getting started in the first place. And by efficiency, let's define it narrowly as economic efficiency of reducing the unit cost of production, because, or more specifically, reducing the cost of labor. The obvious benefit to bringing women into the workforce was reducing the cost of labor. Because now you've doubled the labor supply, you can cut wages in half. And of course, given that the socialists wanted to have full employment so they could have a national strike, a la Sorel, the more people you have in the workforce, the power shifts to the capitalist class, because they have more choice now, because there's more people competing in the labor market. And I guess what I'm trying to get at here is anarchists, communists, anarcho-capitalists, well, they all sort of ignore this problem, because it's to greater or lesser extent, unless you're narco-primitivist, affects all of them. How do you deal with this erosion of intentional communities or taboos? Because taboos have to be removed to make a classic example of this, right, is in the 90s and early 2000s with the rise of stem cell research. There were so many liberals and new atheists that were saying, oh, these old fuddy-duddy conservative Christian taboos against, for the sanctity of human life are standing in the way of scientific progress. And that appeal has been made for centuries to undermine these taboos. And I've even heard libertarians make them on the Mises forum back in the day when they were full of new atheists. So what I'm saying is I think that's a problem, that's one that I haven't thrown at anybody yet, to be fair. But I wonder what a libertarian would say to that, or a right-wing anarchist.
Well, I would okay. So I would disagree with Alul that there is an inherent tendency within sort of technology to degrade boundaries, because I would say that it's going to depend on how it is used. That is the main thing. Now, does it have... Now, this isn't to say that technology per se doesn't have any inbuilt directedness in a certain sense by the creator. So, for instance, Twitter would be a good example. It's hardly set up to be a place of nuance and reasoned debate, because you have 140 characters. So that's obviously built into the technology. But the question arises, on the most abstract level of the technology, is that something that would necessarily result? So, I mean, for example, with standing in the way of progress with the new atheists, well, again, I would say that's largely a cultural problem. What constitutes progress? And if you had a very clear concept of what constituted progress and what didn't constitute progress, then you could channel the technique in areas that you thought were preferable. So, for instance, it could well be the case with the stem cell thing that you'd have much greater development of adult stem cell research now than you otherwise would have done if they hadn't liberalized the ones on embryonic stem cell research, which may or may not be on a technique level better or worse, but it's not obvious. I mean, it could well be better, but just because they thought at the time the embryonic ones were better, then that's the way they went. So I think to a large extent this is mostly a cultural issue, although I will acknowledge on the margin there will be people who go, oh, actually, this is going to be in my interest to do this. And it is true, if you have enough people on the margin who decide that, then you could eventually erode taboos. But I think this is a general cultural question more than anything else. Unless you want to say anything else there was two other objections that you raised I haven't responded to yet, that you mentioned.
That's before. Right, yeah.
So we did that. So standardization and R&D. So standardization, your point was NATO wants standardized equipment. And so, how...
Well, just real quick, the TLDR is, if you look at the American gun market, because it's tailored to consumer taste, you have a lot of different guns with a lot of different ammunition types with a lot of different spare parts, all of which is great for consumer maximized, utility. But it's terrible for fighting a war, which is why NATO wanted to standardize their ammunition, the spare parts, the rifles, in order to. So the market drive is to maximize consumer utility, which is to create a plethora of guns and ammunition. But that's going to create complications for military action.
Possibly. But even assuming it did, the demand for such weaponry would be radically different. Because imagine you actually have a genuine militia that is ready to fight when it needs to. So it's going to be, at least in the interest of the local militia, to have, insofar as it is useful, to have standardized equipment. Now, it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be any additional ones, because remember, with standardization, I think to a large extent, you just need the minimum amount of standardization. You don't need everything to be standardized, because in a certain sense, having non-standardized weaponry could in principle be a benefit, because at least insofar as the enemy doesn't know what weaponry you're going to be using, because they can't defend against it. Now, of course, you could say, well, it depends on the type, because if it's within a certain class, then yes, we can defend against it. But nevertheless, it's possibly a benefit, which actually leads on to the last objection, which response in a second, I think moves on quite nicely, to the R&D, which is how do any military contractors show anybody that they're better than anybody else without leaking all their secrets? Because otherwise, you're going to have widespread knowledge of new technology, which is going to mean either it could be copied by enemies and or they will know it and so can prepare for it. Well, there's a couple of ways to respond to that. The first is, even if they know that you can do something, it doesn't mean they can replicate it. So, for instance, in the early 20th century, there was a competitor to Cadbury. Now, it's a completely different example, but I think that it's an interesting one. There was a competitor to Cadbury's in the early 20th century in England, and they tried to replicate the flavor of Cadbury's chocolate. And they couldn't. They had it in their hands. They could eat it. They could chemically analyze it. They could see what was in it, but they couldn't replicate the process. So knowing that you could do something doesn't necessarily mean that you can actually replicate it. Because you can see what it is, but you don't know how to necessarily put it together so it does what it does. Secondly, how could you prevent this knowledge getting out? Again, just one thing is the knowledge of the new technology getting out could be a good thing. Could dissuade people from attacking you. So this is like the whole, to our extent, the open and concealed carry debate. Is it better to have open carry, or is it better to have concealed carry? Well, open carry, they know what they've got, so they don't attack you. But you've got concealed carry. Oh, you could have stuff that we don't know. So that again isn't, I don't think, 100% obvious. But supposing it was, you could, I imagine you could have various people in the community, or maybe militia commanders or whatever, who are the ones who have the private showings of the new contractors, and you get respected people in the community who go, okay, no, we've seen this. This is good. It is worth paying. They are better, but we can't exactly say why for sort of secret purposes, for secrecy purposes. And related to this is how a sort of spy networks potentially could work as well. I've seen this stuff. It's good. You trust me. It's worth going for. And then it's going to be a trade-off basically on, if you've got two people saying for one company or another, who do we trust the most? Now, whether or not that would be stable or not is another question, but it's at least a potential response to your objection.
Well, I think another thing you could say is any sort of business review board would hire technical professionals to work with them to analyze. So what would happen is the R&D groups would have non-disclosure agreements with professional technicians from this review board, that all they would be allowed to say is, it works, but we can't tell you how or why. And so if you have non-disclosure agreements with these people, and they are also maybe retired professionals from that field, and they're working for these consumer review boards, then they could say, well, look, trust us. We know what we're talking about. We're just not at liberty to discuss how this works or why it works.
I think that's entirely plausible. I think it's going to be some form of reputation system, and you're going to have to get the reputation from elsewhere. But I don't see why that's necessarily a problem. You have companies that go from one area to another. Why do you trust us doing this? Well, I could do this other thing really well. I mean, so trust me, I probably can. So I think those are a potential a potential solution. One final thing I would say, I think insofar as you have a militia as your major defense force, it's likely to actually protect areas that you care about. You're going to have much more input between the people at the bottom and the people, supposing it goes up to a high military commander over a certain area, to defend areas that you care about defending. Because when it comes to state wars, they'll defend various areas they think are of strategic significance and let everything else get blown up, which is, you could argue, is good in one respect, but is bad at actually protecting people in various areas which you might actually want to protect. Now, of course, might be a trade-off between, oh, well, putting more resources in strategic area. In certain circumstances, it might make sense to sacrifice the areas. That's possibly true. But I do think, at least insofar as you have the status wars from, I don't know, the 18th century and 19th onwards, the probability, you had increased probability that, the central power is just going to throw half the country under a bus because, well, they don't care and they just want to win. And I think that is a distinct advantage of sort of the militia and sort of private contractor model that you don't get in standard sort of nationalized armies.
Exactly. So, given that we're about out of time, is there any sort of final thought you'd like to leave us with?
What I would say is, I think there are a lot of reasons to expect why, although I do think the question of how technologically advanced a libertarian society would be is an interesting one. I do think there's various theoretical reasons to expect a libertarian society to be relatively rich in comparison with its neighbors. And that is helpful in the funding of the problems we've cited. Just say, I don't think this model I'm proposing is necessarily the model that would always work, or whether it's is the only model. There may be other models that work. If you've got sort of a pan-anarchist society, libertarian enclaves, whatever, there'll be different ways of doing it, and maybe some things are going to be better than this. I do think, for the reason I've outlined, this is probably going to be the best way of doing it, but I could be wrong. But also, the last thing to remember is, yes, of course, the libertarian society could always lose. But the question is, what's the probability of them losing? And even if they were to lose, what's preferable? Having a libertarian society for 200 years, which is then invaded, or to have a status society for 200 years, which isn't? Well, that depends on the relative degree of internal and external oppression. Because what we've discussed at present is basically overseas oppression. And then you've got to weigh this with domestic oppression by the state. And then, of course, if you have a state army, well, you can still get invaded by another state. And then the question is, well, what's the relative oppression level of the state that you're in at present and the state that might invade you and conquer you? So even if it is the case, you think that under certain circumstances, the anarchist libertarian, I'm using these synonymously, would lose, well, then fine. But the question is, would a status society perform that much better? And if it did, at what cost? So that would be my general sort of meta view of the issue.
I think what I would say, and you correct me if you disagree or not, but I think what this has done, not just this particular conversation, but all the conversations up to this, has shifted the focus of the debate from the more generic, well, could you, Mr. Libertarian, could you defeat a Nazi panzer division by privately paying for defense, which is the typical knee-jerk reaction from a lot of normies, to, okay, understanding that libertarian defense is going to have a lot lower costs than maintaining a global empire, fine. That means the difficulty of the problem is much smaller, because a lot of people have a knee-jerk assumption that national defense is equivalent to what the United States is doing today. And then secondly, even libertarians like Bob Murphy. So I'm not just saying that. So what I think this has moved the conversation to is that if you reduce the unit cost of production by defending a smaller area, and you rely on deterrence mechanisms, like in the video with Keith, you mentioned submarines, landmines, air defense missiles, you create a narrower band of discussion. It doesn't mean that you're going to pass that test, but what it's saying is that the test that has to be passed is a lot more narrow, circumscribed, and defined than where it has been for the last 20 years. Would you agree?
I think that's broadly fair. What I would say is, in general, I do think there is. It, this is where I think actually the left libertarians are probably more interesting than right libertarians to a large extent. Is that they take seriously that the libertarian society be radically different than the current society. Whereas I think the issue with, say, the Hoppian position with defense, the Murphyite one, is you go, well, insurance companies do all the good stuff at the moment, so let's just get them to do more things. And we'll have this sort of like corporate society, although corporations maybe not quite as big, but we still have the corporate model. Now, you could defend the corporate model. I'm not necessarily against the corporate model per se. But it's, I think, moving away from the idea that, well, what we really are like Reaganites from the 80s, but with no taxes. And we're just going to have sort of like the 80s economy, but on steroids with modern technology. I think the conclusion would be no, any such society like this would be quite a lot different. And I think as a side with that, the more I think about international trade around the world, I kind of think, well, if it's not subsidized and you don't have state navies patrolling all the lines. Now, I'm not saying they couldn't do. It's just a lot of international trade, a lot of the costs are basically passed on to the taxpayer. I mean, to what extent would the trade look like? I mean, you're really having to envisage a very, very different world. And that's something that's an ongoing project of my own, really, is on the background. I'm always thinking, okay, what would it look like? And it's very, very, very difficult because the incentives are different. You can't use current prices because the prices would be different, because the incentives would be different. And the whole thing, and so you can only sketch it very broadly. But my intuition, I think, is the case. You're going to have something very different from what we currently have. And so if you're going to defend that, you're going to have a better idea of what that would be like, and not just default to, oh, well, we're just going to have corporate economy, but better.
All right. Well, thanks again, Swithun. It's always a pleasure. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.